few questions right now. It's a little hard to see. I guess why don't we take... Oh, hold on. We're...
This guy in the back, he was first.
I just called on this person. I think if I'm doing it, I'll do it, and I'll call you next.
As far as fixing the...
As far as fixing...
fixing the political dysfunction in this country, one idea I've heard mentioned in various places, I've already mentioned here, is having a constitutional convention or a constitutional amendment to abolish corporate personhood or to get corporate money out of politics.
So, hold on just a sec. He's talking about corporate personhood and getting the money out of that stream in politics?
Yeah, these are very good things to do, but you can't do this or anything else unless there's a large, active, popular base. If the Occupy movement was, the leading force in the country, you could push this forward. But remember, most people don't know that this is happening. They may know about it, but not know what it is. And among those who do know, polls show that there's a lot of support, but that assigns a task. It's necessary to get out into the country and get people to understand what this is about and what they can do about it and what the consequences are of not doing anything about it. And corporate personhood is an important case in point, but pay attention to what it is. We should think about it. Now, if you read we're supposed to worship the Constitution these days. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution says that no person shall be deprived of rights without due process, of law. Well, the Founding Fathers didn't mean by person, they didn't mean person. So, for example, there were a lot of creatures of flesh and blood who weren't persons. The indigenous population, for example, they didn't have any rights. There was a category of creatures called 3/5 human in the Constitution, slave population. They weren't persons. And in fact, women were barely persons, so they didn't have rights. Well, a lot of this was somewhat rectified over the years. During the Civil War, the 14th Amendment raised the 3/5 humans to full humans, at least in principle. That was only in principle. I won't go through what happened next, but at least in principle. Now, if you come to over the following years, the concept of person was changed by the courts in two ways. One way was to broaden it to include corporations, legal fictions established and sustained by the state. In fact, these persons later became the management of corporations, according to the court decisions. So the management of corporations, they became persons. Of course, that's not what the 14th Amendment says. It was also narrowed to undocumented immigrants. They had to be excluded from the category of persons. And that's happening right now. So the legislations that you're talking about, they go two ways. They broaden the category of persons to include corporate persons, which by now have rights way beyond human beings, given by the trade agreements and others. And they exclude people who flee from, Central America, where the U.S. devastated their homelands, free from Mexico, because they can't compete with the U.S. Highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness. Remember when NAFTA was passed in 1994, Clinton administration understood pretty well that it was going to devastate the Mexican economy. And that's the year when they started militarizing the border. Well, okay, now we're getting the consequences, and these people have to be excluded from the category of persons. So when you talk about personhood, that's right, but there's more than one aspect to it, and it ought to be pushed forward, and all ought to be understood and acted upon, but that requires a mass base. It requires that the population understands this and is committed to it. So it's easy to think of a lot of things that should be done. but they all have a prerequisite, namely a mass popular base is there which is committed to implementing them.
And we have a question about the ruling class in America. How likely is it that they will have an open fascist system here?
I think it's very unlikely, frankly. They don't have the force. About a century ago, in the freest countries in the world, Britain and the United States, at that time, the dominant classes came to understand that they can't control the population by force any longer. Too much freedom had been won by struggles like these. So they realized it. I mean, it's self-conscious, discussed in their literature, and they recognized they're going to have to shift tactics to control of attitudes and beliefs instead of just the cudgel. Throw away the cudgel, but it's not can't do what it used to do. You have to control attitudes and beliefs, and in fact, that's when the public relations industry began in the United States and England, the free countries, where you had to have a major industry to control beliefs and attitudes, to induce consumerism, induce passivity, apathy, distraction, all the things you know very well. And that's the way it's been going on. But it's a barrier, but it's a lot easier to overcome than torture and the Gestapo. And I don't think they are anymore in the circumstances exist any longer for instituting anything like what we called fascism.
Excellent. And John from the library would like to ask his question, and then I have a few notes here. If you stand up, I will pass a note card to you, and if you could write your question. I've got one question over here and one question over there headed towards me, but if you stand up, we'll try to fit in a few others.
Sir, I have a two-part question that I've been waiting to ask you my whole life. You mentioned earlier that sit-down protests were just precursors to a takeover of industry. I would like to ask you if today you would advocate a general strike as an effective tactic moving forward. And second, would you ever, if asked, allow for your voice to relay the democratically chosen will of our nation?
I'm not sure I understand. My voice wouldn't help. I can't even reach you. And besides, you don't want leaders. You want to do it yourself. Not that I could be one. Table. We need representation, but you should pick it yourselves, and they should be recallable representatives. So you're not going to fall into some system of control and hierarchy. But it's this question of the general strike is like the others. You can think of it as a possible idea at a time when the population is ready for it. We can't sit here and declare a general strike, obviously. There has to be approval, agreement, willingness to take the risks to participate on the part of the large mass of the population. And that takes organization, education, activism. Education doesn't mean just telling people what to believe. It means learning ourselves. There's a famous line of Karl Marx, which I'm sure you all know, that the task is not just to understand the world, but to change it. And there's a variant of that which also should be kept in mind. If you want to change the world in a constructive direction, you better try to understand it first. And understanding it doesn't mean listening to a talk, reading a book, although that's helpful sometimes. It means learning, and you learn through participation. You learn from others. You learn from the people you're trying to organize. And you have to gain the experience and understanding which will make it possible to maybe to implement ideas like that as a tactic. But there's a long way to go. That doesn't happen by a flick of a wrist. That happens by hard, long-term, dedicated work. And I think in many ways maybe the most exciting aspect of the Occupy movement is just the construction of these associations, bonds, linkages, and others that are taking place all over the place, all over, whether it's a cooperative kitchen or something else. And out of that, if they can be sustained, can come and expanded to the large part of the population that doesn't even know what's going on. If that can happen, then you can raise questions about tactics like this, which could very well at some point be appropriate.
And we have two questions about the Occupy worldwide. How do you think we can effectively target problems to bring about change? And what should we make demands?
Yeah, well, they should have proposals and ideas. They don't have to be total agreement on them. There's good reason to let 100 flowers bloom. There's lots of possibilities. But there are very sensible proposals, starting from very short-term ones, to let's prevent the Deficit Commission from carrying out a really lethal blow against the society that might have lasting effects in the next couple of weeks. That's pretty short-term. There are longer-term things like, say, the ones I mentioned, helping the workforce in the Boston suburb I mentioned to take over their own industry instead of becoming jobless, going on to, say, maybe do the same thing with the whole auto industry. And there's many more things like that coming along. Turning the country to a leader in the effort to try to mitigate, maybe overcome the tremendous threat of global warming, instead of a follower, in fact, a leader in the practically the only participant in the campaign to accelerate the threat. All of those are things that you can do. We should have those proposals. Dealing with corporate personhood is another proposal, but I would suggest that it be broadened to deal with the distortion, gross distortion in the concept of person, which both broadens it to include corporate entities and narrows it to exclude people. People who have every reason to be treated as persons. And there are plenty of other demands you can think of. And they should be formulated. Maybe not everyone has to agree on the ranking of priorities or even the choice of demands, but groups can pursue them. And there's a lot that can be done.
Should we rewrite the system, and how can we mobilize the American public?
The only way to mobilize the American public that I've ever heard of, or any other public, is by going out and joining them. So going out to wherever people are, churches, clubs, schools, unions, wherever they may be, and getting involved with them and trying to learn yourself from them and to bring about a change of consciousness among them. And again, this can be very concrete. I mean, take, say, the electoral system in the United States. It has a lot of flaws, like what I mentioned, that public policy and public opinion are so radically divorced. But there's some narrower things that you can do something about right away. I mean, we're coming up to the primary system, okay? Suppose we had a functioning democratic society. Let's just imagine that. What would a primary be, say New Hampshire? What would happen at a primary would be that the people in a town would get together and discuss and talk about and argue about what they want policy to be. Kind of like what goes on here. And they should formulate their conception of what the policy should be. Then if a candidate says, I want to come talk to you, the people in the town ought to say, well, you can come listen to us if you want. So you come in, we'll tell you what we want, and if you can sort of persuade us that maybe you'll do it, maybe we'll vote for you. That's what would happen in a democratic society. But what happens in our society? The candidate comes to town with his PR agents and the rest of them, and gives some talks and says, look how great I am, this is what I'm going to do for you. Anybody with a gray cell functioning doesn't believe what he or she says. And then, maybe they vote for him, maybe they don't. Now, that's very different from a democratic society. And, you know, making moves in that direction is not utopian. Those are things that can be done in particular communities. And it could lead to a noticeable change in the political system. I mean, yeah, sure, we should get money out of politics, but that's going to take, yeah, a lot of work. And one way to go at it is just to elect our own representatives. It's not impossible. And, you know, the same is true all across the board. I mean, let's go back to the deficit again. The population understands that it's not the primary problem. In fact, not even a major problem. The population has a sensible attitude about what ought to be done with it. Higher taxes for the rich, let's go back to the way things were during the big growth periods, and preserve the benefits, which are limited. They ought to be improved. But there's something else which isn't even being discussed. The deficit would be eliminated, literally, if the United States had a healthcare system of a kind that other industrial countries have. Now, you know, that's literally true. And that's not utopian. You know, the idea that we should have a healthcare system like other industrial countries, that's not kind of wild, radical raving. But that would not probably leave a surplus. The U.S., I'm sure you all know, has its healthcare system's a total international scandal. It's about twice the per capita costs of comparable countries, some of the worst outcomes. A huge number of people just uninsured altogether. And it's going to get worse. The problem is not Medicare. Medicare is indeed a problem. They talk about that. But it's a problem because it goes through the privatized, unregulated system, which is totally dysfunctional. Well, you can't talk about this in Washington because of the power of financial institutions. The public, a large part of the public wants it. In fact, for decades, substantial parts of the population, often big majorities, have been in favor of this, but it can't be talked about. Too much power now of financial institutions. Well, that can be changed. You know, it's not pie in the sky. And to the extent that the deficit is a problem, that's one thing that could be done about it. And the other thing that could be done, you all know about, our crazed military system, which has about the same expenses as the rest of the world combined, not for defense. In fact, it's actually harmful to us if you look at it. That doesn't have to be like that. So there are things that are quite feasible. But of course, proposals about them have to be made, and they have to be brought to the population in a convincing way, and most of the population already agrees to most of them. But you got to turn it into a force that'll be active and engaged. Then you can have results.
Mic check.
Mic check.
Mic check.
What are your thoughts on publicly financed campaigns?
I also have 2 points of information. This presentation is on the live stream and will be recorded at occupyboston.com. You can look on the live stream and come back. I also have a phone number. It seems a little odd to say, but if you could call this number, 605-475-4001, and then put in the code 612891, you can hear it live. And one other point of information, there is Occupy Congress. Look for it on the web. It's very new. Let's just do it.
Well, I think that's a pretty good answer to the question of publicly financed campaigns. Let's just do it. We pick our own representatives. We finance them. We vote for them. And if the corporations pour money into somebody else's pockets, okay, they can spend it on luxury goods. That can be done, but only if you have an organized, engaged public. There's lots of things you can propose, but they all go back to the same basic conclusion. You have to have an organized, dedicated public that's willing to implement them. And if there is, a lot of options are open up, including these.
So I think this will be the last question. Could you please share your thoughts on the significance of the Occupy the Hood movement and any insights you may have regarding cross-cultural organization for social change?
Oh, that's a great movement. I heard just coming out here this evening that the first Occupy Hood action took place just yesterday in Boston, and it's been happening in other places, New York and elsewhere, and that's perfect. I mean, it's the kind of reaching out into the general community that makes sense. People have to do it themselves. You know, I can't tell people how to organize in Roxbury, and if I told them, they shouldn't listen to me. They know how to do it, and we should work hard to get this integrated. And that means, again, not just telling people, here's what you got to believe, but learning from them. What do they want? What do they need? What can we learn from them? How can we find ways to work together to overcome barriers and tensions and become part of a dedicated, ongoing, sustained movement, which, and I stress again, is going to have to last a long time, because most of these goals that we're talking about can't be attained in a couple of weeks or months. Actually, some of them can, but most of them are a long struggle. And people with power don't give it up unless they have to. And that takes work.
I hope I wasn't getting in your way and all your
We're not getting out of here quickly. There's a lot of people in this camp.
Carlos, nice seeing you here again. See you on Tuesday. Take care of yourself, guys. Lovely.